On a quiet Saturday afternoon in Southern California, Paul Walker was not filming a movie. He was not chasing speed for a camera. He was simply leaving a charity event, smiling, relaxed, thinking about dinner plans and upcoming projects. Less than a minute later, everything was over. The Porsche Carrera GT never made it home. In just a handful of seconds, metal twisted, fire erupted, and one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces was gone. Not on screen, but in real life, without a stunt double, without a second take. How did a routine drive turn into a fatal crash? What really happened inside that car in the final moments before impact? And why did Paul Walker's death spark years of investigations, lawsuits, and unanswered questions that still divide experts and fans alike? This is not the story of a movie star's career. This is the story of a final ride. The decisions made, the warnings ignored, and the 33 seconds that redefined a legacy forever. Tonight we slow time down. We return to the last moments before the crash and follow the trail back through the life that led Paul Walker to that road. The news spread with stunning speed. Within minutes of the crash, eyewitness photos began circulating online. Within an hour, headlines around the world carried the same shocking words: Paul Walker is dead. For fans, it felt impossible. Paul Walker was only 40 years old. He was in the middle of filming Fast and Furious 7. He was a father, a humanitarian, a man whose public image was inseparable from youth, motion, and life in forward gear. The idea that he could be gone, instantly, violently, and without warning, felt unreal. Hollywood froze, co-stars broke down mid-interviews, film sets shut down. Vin Diesel arrived at the crash site in tears, asking photographers to stop filming, begging fans to pray. Universal Pictures halted production indefinitely, unsure whether the franchise could, or should, continue without him. Social media turned into a digital memorial almost overnight. Fans gathered at the crash site, lighting candles, leaving handwritten notes, toy cars, and Fast and Furious posters. The street where the Porsche had crashed transformed into a vigil, a place of silence broken only by the sound of passing traffic, a cruel reminder of how ordinary the road had been. But as the shock began to settle, questions emerged. Paul Walker was known for loving cars, but he was also known for caution. He was not reckless. He was not intoxicated. Toxicology reports would later confirm there was no alcohol or drugs in his system. This wasn't the familiar narrative of a celebrity undone by excess. So what went wrong? Why did a modern supercar, driven by an experienced driver, lose control so catastrophically on a suburban road? Why did the vehicle ignite almost instantly after impact? And why did this crash, unlike so many others, trigger years of legal battles, expert disagreements, and whispered doubts? As tributes poured in, another story began to form beneath the grief. Investigators arrived, engineers analyzed debris, lawyers prepared lawsuits. Porsche issued statements, and slowly the focus shifted away from mourning toward responsibility. Paul Walker's death was no longer just a tragedy. It was becoming a case study, a case about speed versus design, human error versus mechanical limits, and whether this crash was simply a freak accident or something that could have been prevented. To understand how the world reached that moment of disbelief and why the aftermath became so contentious, we have to go backward. Before the crash, before the headlines, before the fire, we have to return to the life Paul Walker was living in, the weeks and days leading up to that final ride. Long before Paul Walker became a global action icon, his life followed a quieter, almost unlikely path to fame. Born in Glendale, California, Paul was introduced to the entertainment industry as a child, appearing in commercials before he was even old enough to understand what fame meant. Acting was never framed as destiny in his household. It was simply something he did, a job, not an identity. Friends from his early years would later describe him as gentle, curious, and disarmingly normal for someone growing up around cameras. As he moved into adulthood, success came slowly. For years, Paul drifted through supporting roles, teen dramas, and low-budget films. He was recognizable, but not yet essential. Hollywood saw him as another handsome face, replaceable, temporary. Then came the Fast and the Furious. the film was never expected to become a cultural phenomenon. It was a modest action movie built around cars, speed, and adrenaline. But something unexpected happened. The franchise exploded, and with it, Paul Walker's image fused permanently with the idea of motion, velocity, and risk. To the public, he became synonymous with speed. Behind the scenes, however, the reality was more complex. Paul loved cars deeply, but his fascination wasn't about recklessness or ego. He was a student of mechanics, engineering, and performance. He spent hours discussing torque, balance, and handling. Unlike many celebrities who collected exotic cars as status symbols, Paul treated them as machines to be respected. He was known to remind friends that high-performance vehicles demanded discipline. That mistakes happened faster than people realized, that physics never cared who you were. Away from Hollywood, Paul carved out a life that rarely made headlines. He became deeply involved in humanitarian work, founding Reach Out worldwide to deliver aid to disaster zones. He traveled quietly, often without press, helping victims of earthquakes and hurricanes. Those closest to him saw this work as his true passion, not red carpets or box office numbers. Yet even as his public persona grew larger, Paul remained uncomfortable with celebrity. He avoided parties. He disliked attention. He spoke often about wanting a simpler life, about stepping away from acting to focus on family and philanthropy. Friends noticed a man pulled in two directions, one by global fame, the other by a desire to disappear from it. As Fast and Furious sequels multiplied, the pressure increased. Each film demanded more spectacle, more danger, more myth-making. The gap between Paul Walker, the actor, and Paul Walker, the human, quietly widened. In the months leading up to his death, Paul was at a crossroads. Production on Fast and Furious 7 had begun, locking him once again into the franchise that defined him. At the same time, he was investing more energy into charity work, planning future missions, and talking about life beyond Hollywood. He spoke about slowing down, ironically, at the very moment his career demanded acceleration. Those around him would later say he seemed content, grounded, even optimistic. There were no public signs of crisis, no spirals, no warnings splashed across tabloids. Which is why what happened next felt so profoundly cruel. Because the road that would end Paul Walker's life was not a racetrack. It was not a movie set. It was an ordinary stretch of pavement he had traveled before, on a day that began with kindness, generosity, and routine. To understand how everything unraveled, we must move closer to the final hours, to the moments just before the last ride began. To understand how Paul Walker's final moments became possible, we need to examine what most headlines simplified, and what few people truly understood. The danger did not begin on the road that afternoon. It began long before the engine was ever started. The Porsche Carrera GT was not an ordinary supercar. It was a machine built on the edge of engineering limits, designed with racing DNA and minimal tolerance for error. Its carbon fiber chassis, low ground clearance, and rear engine layout delivered breathtaking performance, but also demanded absolute precision from the driver. Even experienced drivers respected it, some feared it. Unlike newer hypercars equipped with modern electronic stability systems, the Carrera GT relied heavily on driver skill. There was no advanced traction control to correct sudden loss of grip. No digital safety net to compensate for misjudgment. When things went wrong, they happened fast, brutally fast. Paul Walker understood this. So did Roger Rodas, the man driving that day. Rodas was not reckless. He was a professional, an experienced racer, and the CEO of a performance car tuning shop. He had driven powerful vehicles countless times. To many, that made the crash even harder to accept. But expertise does not eliminate risk. Sometimes it sharpens it. In the weeks leading up to the crash, subtle factors quietly aligned. The Carrera GT's tires were older than recommended for optimal high-speed performance. The road surface in Santa Clarita was uneven, with subtle curves that encouraged acceleration before abruptly tightening. A light pole and tree stood dangerously close to the roadway, offering no margin for recovery. None of these elements alone guaranteed disaster. Together, they created a perfect trap. There is also the psychological factor few like to discuss: familiarity. When drivers know a road well, caution can soften. Confidence replaces vigilance. And when a powerful machine responds smoothly, right up until it doesn't, reaction time evaporates. What makes Paul Walker's case uniquely haunting is that there was no chaos before the crash, no shouting, no panic, no dramatic warning, just acceleration, a slight loss of control, and then physics taking over. Investigators would later reconstruct the sequence frame by frame. They would calculate speed, angle, trajectory. They would debate whether the car was traveling well above the posted limit or merely beyond what the road could forgive. But numbers cannot capture the human reality. Inside that vehicle were two men who believed they were in control, until control vanished. The collision was catastrophic. The Porsche struck fixed objects with enormous force, rupturing the fuel system. Fire erupted almost instantly, engulfing the vehicle before help could reach it. There was no second chance, no heroic rescue, no last-second escape. The brilliance of the Carrera GT, the very thing that made it legendary, became its fatal flaw. And yet, even after the flames died down, the questions did not. Because when tragedy intersects with technology, responsibility becomes blurred. Was this a matter of speed alone, or design, or a system that allowed such a machine to exist on public roads? These questions would soon spill far beyond the crash site, into courtrooms, expert testimonies, and years of legal warfare. But before that storm erupted, there was one final stretch of time we have not yet examined, the last hours, the final ride. November 30th, 2013 began like countless other Saturdays in Southern California. There was no sense of danger in the air, no foreboding headlines, no final phone calls filled with dread. Paul Walker woke up focused on something that mattered deeply to him, helping others. That morning, he attended a charity event organized by Reach Out Worldwide, the disaster relief organization he had founded years earlier. The event was meant to raise funds for victims of Typhoon Haiyan, a catastrophe that had devastated communities across Southeast Asia. For Paul, this was not publicity work. This was personal. He moved through the venue comfortably, speaking with guests, thanking volunteers, taking photos without urgency. Those who saw him that day would later say the same thing. He seemed calm, present, happy. There was no alcohol involved, no visible stress, no signs of recklessness. Paul talked about upcoming shoots, about travel, about spending time with his daughter. It was the version of him most people rarely saw, grounded, focused, unguarded by performance. As the event wound down in the early afternoon, Paul prepared to leave. There were no dramatic plans, just a short drive. A transition from one ordinary moment to the next. He walked toward the parking area where several high-performance cars were parked. Among them was the red Porsche Carrera GT, a vehicle admired, respected, and understood by those who knew what it was capable of. Roger Rodas would be driving. Paul would take the passenger seat. Witnesses recalled no excitement, no showing off. The car did not roar to life in defiance. It simply pulled away, merging into traffic like any other vehicle. This is what makes the timeline so unsettling. There was no escalation, no warning curve in the narrative, no point where someone could say, this is where it went wrong. In the minutes that followed, the Porsche traveled through familiar streets. Roads Paul had driven many times before. Streets lined with trees, streetlights, and modest buildings. Not a racetrack, not a highway built for speed. Inside the car, conversation may have drifted casually. Or maybe it fell quiet. There is no recording, no transcript. Only the understanding that nothing about the moment suggested finality. Then suddenly, the margin disappeared. In a matter of seconds, the vehicle lost control. The rear end stepped out. The tires failed to grip. The Porsche veered violently off course, striking a fixed object with devastating force. The crash was over almost as quickly as it began. Fire erupted instantly. Bystanders ran toward the wreckage, but the heat was overwhelming. Flames consumed the vehicle before anyone could reach the occupants. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Paul Walker was gone. What followed was silence, the kind that arrives only after something irreversible has occurred. The road was shut down, the area sealed. Investigators began their work. News helicopters circled overhead, And slowly, painfully, confirmation spread that the actor known for surviving impossible crashes on screen had died in a real one. Without a stunt double, without special effects, without escape. Yet even in the immediate aftermath, one truth stood out. Paul Walker did not die chasing danger. He died leaving a charity event. And as the shock settled, the world would soon realize that the crash itself was only the beginning of a much longer and more complicated story. Investigators would later reduce Paul Walker's final moments to data points: speed, distance, impact angles, timestamps. But in real life, those seconds unfolded without numbers, without narration, and without mercy. The Porsche Carrera GT entered a stretch of road that narrowed subtly, a place where the margin for error collapsed without warning. The car was moving fast, faster than the road could tolerate, but not in a way that felt dramatic inside the cabin. There was no sudden scream of tires that lasted long enough to correct. No cinematic warning shot. The rear of the vehicle broke loose. At that speed, once traction was lost, recovery became almost impossible. The car rotated, crossed lanes, and slammed into fixed objects lining the roadside. The force of the impact was immense, instantly compromising the structure of the vehicle. Within seconds, fuel ignited. Flames engulfed the Porsche before the echo of the crash fully faded. Witnesses described a fireball so intense that approaching the wreckage felt physically impossible. The heat radiated outward, forcing people back despite their instinct to help. Inside the vehicle, there was no time. The impact itself was fatal. The fire that followed erased any remaining chance of survival. Emergency services arrived quickly, but the outcome had already been sealed in the first violent moments of contact. There were no last words recorded. No final phone call. No farewell message left behind. Paul Walker's life ended not with drama, but with sudden finality, the kind that leaves nothing to process, no opportunity for closure in the moment itself. As firefighters extinguished the flames, the reality set in. This was not a movie scene. There would be no sequel rewrite, no alternate ending. The road was cleared, the wreckage removed, and what remained was a question that would echo far beyond that afternoon. How could this have happened? Because when the shock faded, when the tributes slowed, and when the cameras turned away from the crash site, a deeper examination began, one that would stretch on for years. An examination not just of speed, but of responsibility. In the days that followed the crash, grief gave way to scrutiny. Investigators from multiple agencies descended on the scene, combing through debris, measuring skid marks, analyzing telemetry, and reconstructing the final trajectory of the Porsche. Early statements were cautious, restrained by the need for accuracy in a case already drawing global attention. Then the conclusions began to surface. Authorities determined that the vehicle had been traveling at a speed far above the posted limit when it lost control. Toxicology reports showed no alcohol or drugs in either occupant's system. Mechanical failure, they said, was not the primary cause. On paper, the explanation seemed complete, but for many, it wasn't satisfying. Because speed alone did not explain everything. Questions emerged almost immediately about the Porsche Carrera GT itself. Experts pointed to its lack of modern electronic stability systems, its unforgiving handling characteristics, and its reputation as a car that punished even minor mistakes. Others highlighted the condition of the tires, noting their age and suitability for high-performance driving. Then came the lawsuits. Paul Walker's daughter filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Porsche, arguing that the car's design flaws, not just speed, contributed to the fatal outcome. The suit alleged that the Carrera GT lacked safety features found in less expensive vehicles and that Porsche had failed to warn drivers adequately about the risks. Porsche responded forcefully. The company insisted the car was safe when operated as intended, that it was never designed for excessive speed on public roads. That responsibility lay not with engineering, but with human choice. Over the next several years, the case became a legal battleground between engineering logic and human tragedy. Expert witnesses clashed, documents were released, settlements were reached quietly, without public admissions of fault. But the debate never truly ended. Among fans and automotive communities, Paul Walker's death became a dividing line. Some saw it as a tragic reminder that physics does not bend for fame. Others believed the crash exposed uncomfortable truths about allowing race-bred machines onto everyday streets. Meanwhile, the emotional aftershocks rippled through Hollywood. Production on Fast and Furious 7 resumed only after months of deliberation. Paul's brothers stepped in as stand-ins. Digital technology filled the gaps. The film was completed not as spectacle, but as tribute, its final scenes crafted to honor a man who never got to finish his own story. Yet even as the franchise moved forward, something fundamental had changed. Paul Walker was no longer just an actor remembered for speed. He had become a symbol of its cost, a reminder that the line between thrill and tragedy is thinner than anyone wants to believe. And still, one question lingered beneath every legal filing and expert opinion. If circumstances had shifted just slightly, could Paul Walker still be alive? That question has no answer. All that remains is what he left behind, and what his final moments ask us to confront. In the months and years after Paul Walker's death, the noise slowly faded. The crash site was cleared. The lawsuits settled quietly. The headlines moved on. But something remained, not in court records or investigation files, but in memory. Paul Walker's legacy was never truly about speed. It was about sincerity in a world that often rewards performance over authenticity. Colleagues remembered him as a man who listened more than he spoke, who avoided Hollywood games, who used his fame not to build walls, but to reach places cameras never followed, disaster zones, broken communities, forgotten people. In death, that contrast became sharper than ever. A man celebrated for high-octane films lost his life in a moment defined not by recklessness, but by circumstance. A charity event, a familiar road, a decision that felt ordinary, until it wasn't. There is something deeply unsettling about that, because Paul Walker's final moments offer no grand moral, no easy warning sign we can neatly package and move past. They force us to confront a quieter truth. That tragedy often arrives without drama, without villain, without intent. It arrives when life feels normal, when plans are unfinished, when goodbyes are assumed, not spoken, when tomorrow feels guaranteed. In the end, Paul Walker did not leave the world in the way movies teach us to expect. There was no slow fade-out, no chance to reflect, no last lesson delivered in words. What he left behind was simpler and heavier, a reminder of how thin the line truly is between control and chaos, between momentum and silence, between a life still in motion and a story suddenly frozen in time. And perhaps that is why his death continues to resonate, not because of how fast the car was going, but because of how suddenly everything stopped. Paul Walker's final moments were not heroic, they were human, and in that humanity they became unforgettable.